and welcome back to our creative videos. My name is Loretta Hayes and I am from Hayes Sewing Machine Company in Wilmington, Delaware. And today we have a completely adorable quilt to show you. This quilt here, it is done with a Villa Rosa pattern that I'm afraid I'm going to slaughter the name of. So it's Asagail, I'm thinking.
Sounds good.
If we sound it out phonically, hooked on phonics, you know. So it is a super easy quilt, and we have made it with a completely adorable line of fabrics. This is a new line of fabrics from Benartex. It is referred to, the total name on it is called Robo Boogie. And it is sweet little robots and kind of transistors and that kind of thing. And there's a whole line. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 different types of fabrics. So Pam, if you want to scroll down here, the first one here is a stripey, and these are all in all different colors. I just picked out one color so that people could see the actual pattern. So this one is called Stripey Fuchsia because it's stripey and it's fuchsia. The next style is triangles, and this one is called Triangles Light Lime, and it has a little triangles, and then it's got a little little robot there in the triangles. This one here is one of 2 of the neutrals. So we'll have this style that's a little bit larger scale, and we'll then have a smaller scale we'll talk about. And this has got the little robots, little transistors, and it is called Dance Party White Gray. So super cool. This one only comes in the white and gray on there because this is neutral. The next one is Remote Turquoise. And so it has this cute little grid, and it has the little remote on there. And then once again, available in all kinds of different shades on there. The next one is called Field Day, and this one is orange, cleverly enough. And it also has the little robots that we saw in the dance party one, but they are at a medium scale. So they're not as large as the dance party one are. Our next one is called Parts, and this is light gray. Comes in turquoise and all kinds of other colors. But it's got like the little transistor things on it. So kind of a nice one as a blender if you want something that's a little smaller scale. And then we are back to our neutrals. And this one is called Round, and it's white and gray. And once again, it's going to be just this one. And this is the one that I am using as my neutral in this quilt. On here, and then one more. And this one, oh, excuse me. This is neutral, but this one is also available in colors. So this is also
this is the round. That's cute.
But with colors. And excuse my voice all of a sudden here. All right, so we're going to go ahead and we're going to have Pam swing the camera around, and then we can unload the fabric. So when you are, I was messing around with the fabric and I've messed up my thread, so let me just get this rethreaded here. There we go. So when we start out, when you are cutting, we are going to be cutting 2 sizes of rectangles, of squares.
Squares. So she needs to work on her shapes.
I'm working on shapes next week. All right, so you're going to have a big square, and that is going to be done in all of the colors. And then out of your neutral, you're going to have a small square. And so we're going to have our small square, and we're going to take and we're going to draw a line across that square diagonally.
Yep.
Okay? When we place the small square in the corner of the big square, we're going to make certain that the line that we have drawn are touching the side of the big square. So, this is all the units cut and drawn properly, but the line is going into the corner, and so that will not create what we want. And so we're going to come in and we're going to flip that. So your little check is my line always going to the side of the bigger square? And so we're going to tuck this under. I have done a 1/4 inch foot without a guide for this quilt, because if I am doing this sewing on this line with a guide, it tends to drag on the fabric. So we're going to stitch down the line, and I always, in any of these situations where I'm sewing a square, eventually this square is going to flip up to create a triangle, I always like to draw my line right down the center, and I'm literally sewing just a hair off that line towards the corner. So I'm coming to right where my fingernail is kind of going right there. All right, so we're going to go ahead. We're sewing just slightly to the right of the line. What that gives me is a little bit of pressing flip, so I'm not going to get a wonky square when I'm done. And I would recommend doing this with quick piecing techniques. So we'll line up the next square. We'll sew onto that next square. Once again, just slightly to the right of the line. And you will go along and you will sew all of your squares. So you will have a white, small, neutral one on your big squares on every single one of your squares. So you will just be sewing, sewing, sewing. We'll then go ahead, we'll take that out, and we're going to take and we're going to clip it apart. Some people will take it and flip it over and leave them attached, but I find that's harder to guide. And so we're going to come in and we're going to trim away our excess. So we're going to have a seam allowance that is about 1/4 inch.
But that's smidge less.
Yeah, and you don't really need to worry about it. I would never go get my rotary cutter and my ruler and measure this at 1/4 unless you were planning on doing something with these triangles. And finally, I'm drawing the line. So I'm just going to come in and I'm going to trim that up. So approximately 1/4 inch, nothing too technical there. All right, so now we're going to take our squares, we're going to flip them around 180 degrees, and we are going to place our next neutral square on the opposite side. So opposite diagonally, and we're going to go ahead, once again, do our double check that our line is on the side of the square, and we are going to go ahead and stitch down just slightly to the right of that line. And we'll pick up and we'll do our next one. If you need to stop and pick up your foot to get that tip tucked under, go ahead and do that. And then off we go down, and we would do that on every single square. So we'll then come in, we'll trim out. Okay, and so you will have a unit that looks like this. We're then going to take and we're going to press our triangles. Now, on this case, because I am doing a white neutral, it becomes super important that when I'm pressing, I want to press those seam allowances
to the dark
towards
side.
The dark side, yes. So like if you were doing the same pattern, but you were going to do, say, black as your neutral, you wouldn't have that worry. It does create an interesting circumstance when we start piecing them together, because we won't have like an interlocking seam for that. But I'm much more interested in not having that white seam allowance shadow through the fabric. So we'll go ahead and press that. You can hang out.
I should have that little sign. I should make that sign. She's ironing.
kind of like Roadrunner the coyote.
Yes. Beep beep.
Bam. All right. So now we have all of our squares done. We are going to line them together in a row. Now I have organized my colors, so I have kind of an idea of where things are going to be. So we're going to come in and we're going to line up our squares. So our first square is pointing to the right. Our next square is pointing to the left. Our next square is pointing to the right, left, alternating back and forth.
Got it.
And so we're going to go ahead and we're going to start sewing those together. Now this is the interesting part where we don't have a nestled seam.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't have one pressed on the other because I don't want it to shadow. So you could quilt tack it. I did not quilt tack it. I found it lined up pretty good on its own.
I can't believe what I'm hearing.
I know. Shocking, shocking. This is a simple quilt. All right. But you know yourself. If you're like, you know, if it's off a 16th or a 32nd of an inch off, I'm going to freak out. Then go ahead and quilt tack it. And so we'll come down and sew through our neutral. We'll then take it and flip that up. And then our next one, we'll attach that onto there. And so I'm far more interested in that little join up than I am at the top or the bottom. If I'm off a smidge, it's not going to, you know, so long as it's under 1/4 of an inch, we'll be fine on the seam allowance. But this join up is something that you're going to see from the outside of the quilt. So be focused on that. And then we'll go ahead and line up to the end of the block. And then we have one more seam to complete this row. So we'll line that up. You could put a pin or a clip on that. That would be fine. All right, so we now have our row.
That looks really lovely.
So now we want to press it. So at this point, the quilt becomes a standard block quilt. So row number 1, I pressed the seam allowances towards the left. Row number 2, I pressed the seam allowance to the right, and I alternated it back and forth. So we're going to go ahead. This last row is going to be pressed to the right, so we will go ahead and do that. All right, so we have our row, and I have put a clip. That's kind of my universal marking on my rows, is I put a clip, and my clip is always on the left-hand side. So we can then line this up, and you see how it creates kind of a star shape or a flower or an X, or you know, whatever you want to call that particular shape. All right, so now we're going to come in and we're going to sew this row. And this row I will put some quilt tacks in because
restores my faith.
Yes, restore. You were shocked. Huh?
I was shocked.
All right, and the reason for me for doing that is because if I'm lining up my rows, the first connection is almost always going to be just fine because we're only sewing from here to here.
Mm-hmm.
But the further we get down the row, the more likely we are to have a problem with our intersections getting off. And, you know, sometimes it can only be, you know, 1/8 of an inch or that kind of thing. But if it's going to bug you, and it will bug me, this is just a super simple, easy way of getting it accurate without doing a lot of seam ripping. Anything to avoid the seam ripper. So we're going to take our seam allowances. They're pressed opposite, so they're going to nestle together. We're going to do about 4 little stitches across the seam. We'll cut our thread. We'll lift up, and we'll line up the next ones.
And this is kind of a modern quilt in the fact that it doesn't have a border to it.
It does not have a border. So when you're done piecing these blocks,
You're done.
you're done. And also, really nice quilt. They do 48 blocks, but super, super easy quilt
If you wanted to enlarge.
it. Yeah. And because the big blocks are larger, I mean, it doesn't take you forever to make a larger quilt.
It's not like your blocks are 4 inches finished.
Yes, exactly, exactly. And what's fun about this, I mean, literally, I pieced this last night to prep for this video. And so it took me, I don't know, hour and a half, somewhere in that range. Maybe a little bit longer. I was watching an old movie, so wasn't paying too much attention to the time. All right, so now we're going to take a look at our seam. And if you see on your seam that you have like a little pooch, like I can see this block is just a hair bigger than this block, I want to put that at the bottom. Before I take off, I always like to double check my tacks. So open it up and make sure that you're happy with each one of those intersections. Because if you're not, you can pull that out and you can go ahead and place that back in. All right, so let's take a quick look. It was this lime green that was bigger, so we'll tuck that underneath. And so now I've got my corners lined up. They're stitched down. They can't go anywhere. So the only thing that I'm really paying attention to is that intersection at the corner of the white triangle, just like I did when I was sewing the blocks together. And so we'll sew down, we'll sew right through that tack. When you're sewing your long seams on all quilts, no matter what quilt you're doing, the thing to be aware of is the bottom row tends to go to the left. So make sure that your edges are actually lined up, that it hasn't kind of escaped underneath there and given you a weird seam allowance. And occasionally
Whoops.
that'll happen. So go ahead and lift up your foot, tuck that seam allowance back underneath. And one last little intersection to go. And we will cut our thread and we'll be all set. Now, on that little intersection that we just barely caught, excuse me, if you flip, so I caught this just in time. But if this flipped and you had flipped it the other way, that is not a seam ripperable offense. So all you would do is you would come in and snip it with your scissors and then just push
Flatten
it
it out.
back to flatten it out. So if you're doing that, particularly on a quilt like this where the blocks are rocking back and forth, you will have some seam allowances facing towards the machine and some facing towards you. The ones that face towards you, no problem. The ones that face the machine will sometimes flip. So no need to seam ripper those out. All right, let me just press this last seam and then we will hold this up. All right, should we swing it over here? And so
That is sharp.
is Robo Boogie with the Asagail.
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 Asagail Villa Rosa pattern.